Okay, everybody, good evening. So, in this recording, I will be answering some of your questions that I received in the meantime. A couple of few different questions pertaining mostly to the material from two chapters, and one question that deals with the broader problems of financial and economic crisis that we are now undergoing. So, I will try to answer that one as well. So I will start simply by reading these questions and then trying to answer them as best I can. So the first question was, what is the difference between wage inflation and price inflation? And if both price and wage inflation are inversely related to unemployment, does that mean if price inflation increases, that wage inflation increases too? So the relationship between wage inflation and price inflation. The relationship is very simple. Wage inflation means an increase in the nominal wage rates, which is to say how much money people get for their wages. So if the average price of labor increases, we are talking about wage inflation. General inflation, or price inflation, however you want to call it, is an increase in the price level, in the general price level. So prices of all goods and services as measured by consumer price index. Okay, so these are wage inflation is measures an increase in the prices of labor. Consumer or price inflation in general measures prices of basic necessities, consumer goods or costs of living, however you want to call it. What is the relationship between them? The relationship between them is that almost always, whenever you have a wage inflation, you will have the price inflation, general price inflation as well. And the reason for that is simple, that inflation of any kind happens when the money supply increases significantly. And once money supply significantly increases, all goods and services, prices of all goods and services are going to increase to some degree. So that means labor is a service, and that's one of the prices in the economy. So if the prices of consumer goods increase, in all likelihood the wage rates are going to increase as well. So this then answers the second part of the question, or the second question. If both price and wage inflation are inversely related to unemployment, so they are inversely related to employment, that's the Phillips curve. So that's the Phillips curve, just to remind you. This is Phillips curve general price level. This is the Phillips curve comparing the CPI inflation rate and unemployment rate. This is the Phillips curve comparing wage rate inflation and unemployment rate. So both of them are inversely correlated, inversely related to unemployment, and whenever one of them increases, the other one will increase too. So that means that both of them will be increasing in the same time. Whenever price inflation increases, the wage inflation will increase as well. The next question is Exhibit 3. Is Exhibit 3 in the same Chapter 16 dealing with expectations? So this is the PowerPoint for Chapter 16. So the question says, is Exhibit 3 saying that because 1970 to 2003 there wasn't a Phillips curve, then it doesn't exist? So I'm not 100% sure that I understand the question, but I think what the question implies here, what is the status of the Phillips curve between 1970s and 2003? So between 1950s and 1970, the relationship between inflation and unemployment was exactly as the Phillips curve would predict. So if you would have an increase in prices from one year to another, you will have a drop in unemployment. See, 66 to 68. 65 to 66, and so on. So the relationship seemed to have been just as predicted in the Phillips curve, that there was a inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. But since early 1970s, the relationship started to reverse. So you have quite a bit of these curves that slope upwards. You see here, 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 which means that you have an increase in inflation and you have increase in unemployment or stable unemployment. Many cases, you see, 78, 79, 82, 83. You have the opposite. You have a drop in general price level without any increase in unemployment rate. So all of that was inconsistent with the original Phillips curve. So the fact that the Phillips curve for most years between 1970 and 2003 was not this downward sloping Phillips curve meant that the relationship between inflation and unemployment was not as predicted in the Phillips curve. And to that extent, you can say that the Phillips curve didn't exist in many of these years. That simply means that the relationship between these two variables, inflation and unemployment, did not exist as postulated by the Phillips curve. What we got was actually stagflation, this phenomenon of stagflation, which means stable or relatively low or even negative economic growth and high inflation rate. So you see this vertical between 78 and 79, you have a huge increase in inflation from 8 to 12%, and unemployment stays 6.5%. According to Phillips curve analysis, the unemployment should have dropped precipitously from 6 to 5 or 4%. No, it remained steady. So you have a steady, stable, flat economic trend, productivity, employment, and so on, and you have high inflation. So that was impossible according to the standard Keynesian analysis of the Phillips curve. Okay. So that's that. Next question is, can you explain Exhibit 4 in the same chapter 16? I don't understand what is happening in the windows. Okay, so I'll explain now that this is Exhibit 4, and the windows are three gray windows here, and there is one large curve here. So the context, what is going on here, is that the beginning of the controversy about the role of expectations in macroeconomic equilibrium and how expectations can help explain these anomalies like a vertical Phillips curve or the absence of the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So what Milton Friedman said was that there is a distinction between long-run Phillips curve, which means the type of relationship that exists between the unemployment rate, which is on the horizontal axis on the one hand, and inflation rate on the other hand. There is a difference between this relationship in the long run, which is depicted in this dark red vertical curve, and horizontal downward sloping short-term Phillips curve. So what the image says is that in the short run there is a trade-off. That's the key point. In the short run, you can have a trade-off between slightly higher inflation and lower unemployment, as between points 1 and point 2. But in the long run, you cannot have it. In the long run, you will revert back to point 3, and in the long run, the unemployment is what it is, no matter what happens to the price level. So that's the main point of this Exhibit 1, to show how Milton Friedman redefined the analysis or redefined the way economists saw the Phillips curve. Now he said in the long run, employment or unemployment or real economic growth will be determined by real factors like productivity, technology, size of the labor force, institutions, and so on. In the short run, you can affect it indirectly by changing the money supply. Okay, so these three windows that the student asked about just translate this thing that I just told you into a aggregate supply, aggregate demand analysis. So remember when I told you that you can depict the same relationship between the prices and productivity of the economy in two ways, as a short-run aggregate supply curve and as a Phillips curve. So short-run aggregate supply curve is this light blue, the upward sloping curve. It depicts the relationship between price level on the vertical axis here and real GDP on the horizontal axis. So it shows the same trade-off that the Phillips curve shows. It shows the same trade-off. Why? Because as you increase inflation, as you increase price level, as you move, excuse me, as you move along a given short-run supply curve, inflation rate of the price level increases, but real GDP increases. What the Phillips curve says, as you move along the Phillips curve, from your right to your left, inflation rate increases, but unemployment rate decreases. So that's essentially the same message. To say that production and real GDP increases is pretty much the same as saying that unemployment decreases. When you're producing more, you're using your resources more efficiently. When economy is progressing and growing more quickly, that economy in almost all cases will have a lower unemployment rate. So that's one and the same. So the basic intuition here is the same. And these three windows just show the three stages of what happens when you try to decrease unemployment by increasing price level, and what happens eventually, why that's impossible to happen in the long run. So the first step in this process is moving from the first step is window one. Window one is this long-term equilibrium. Point one in the window one is the same as point one on the big image here. So that's the same thing, just depicted in different ways. This is macroeconomic equilibrium in window one. Why is that a macroeconomic equilibrium? Because the short-run aggregate supply curve, you see, intersects long-run aggregate supply curve and aggregate demand curve. So the entire market is in the equilibrium. And inflation rate is 2%. So the price level is 2%. Now, what happens in window two is a shift from point one to point two on this lower PC1 Phillips curve one. So what happens here is that you increase aggregate demand. You increase aggregate demand, for example, you print more money, what our government is doing right now, and you try to prime the pump, you try to stimulate the economy in that way. Now, Milton Friedman, one thing that you have to remember here, that people have expectations, and people's expectations affect the macroeconomic outcomes, but these expectations are adaptive, which means that people project or people extrapolate from their previous experiences and they assume that the future is going to be pretty much the same as the past. So that means if they experienced in the previous period 2% inflation rate, they're going to expect 2% inflation rate in the future as well. Okay? So these are adaptive expectations. So people learn from previous mistakes and they then try to project the same trend that they experienced beforehand to the future. So you increase aggregate demand, and aggregate demand curve shifts from the previous equilibrium here, intersection of the yellow curve and the green curve. And now the green curve, aggregate demand curve, shifts to the right because you increase the demand. And it intersects the short run aggregate supply curve at point 2. So unemployment, because demand increased, short-run aggregate supply, short-term productivity will increase. So real GDP will increase from Q1 to Q2. So that's exactly the same process depicted in this window 2, the exact same process that is here depicted in the big image as shifting along the lower Phillips curve from point 1 to point 2. You increase the price level, inflation rate, same thing as here. Just here, inflation rate drops, unemployment rate drops from U1 to U2. Okay, so this is natural long-term unemployment rate. It drops below that point here. Productivity increases, unemployment drops. So now the key is the point 3 here. The point 3 here is what's going to happen now, adaptive expectations. So people start discovering that the price level is increasing here. You see, they start to realize that real inflation rate is going to be higher. Here it's maybe 2.5% and so on. So how people react, how workers react when the prices of goods and services start to increase and their wage rates are fixed? What do? They ask for higher wages. As they ask for higher wages, what's going to happen to the short-run aggregate supply curve here? It's going to move to the left. It's going to move to the left. Why this short-run aggregate supply curve is going to move to the left? The simple reason is that the labor cost will increase because worker will ask for higher nominal wages now. Okay, higher nominal wages means higher labor costs for producers. Higher labor costs means lower profitability, which means lower production, lower quantity of goods and services being produced. So then quantity of goods and services goes from this intersection of red and blue curves back to the long-term equilibrium. So the supply curve moves to the left, but the inflation will increase then even more, of course, because you already have the inflated prices of goods and services, but now you have an additional increase because you have a reduction in the goods and the quantity of goods and services because production was decreased, and you have the same quantity of money. So the same quantity of money chasing lower quantity of goods and services, the price of goods and services will have to increase even further. So this point 3 shows this shift in the whole Phillips curve from yellow to the red one and going back to the equilibrium. So equilibrium in window 3 is the same equilibrium as in the big picture here. You're going back to from an inflationary disequilibrium or inflationary gap, as we call it. Inflationary gap is a situation where your production of goods and services is temporarily higher than the real long-term productivity of your economy, which is for the short period of time overstimulated by monetary stimulus. And you have to go back to the long-run equilibrium because the wage rates are going to increase to compensate for the consumer inflation, and as they do so, the productivity will drop and real GDP will decrease alongside the prices that are going to increase, and you end up in the same equilibrium as before. So you see the same thing happening here. This window 3 is just a translation of what happens from going to point 2 to point 3 into the language or vocabulary of aggregate supply, aggregate demand. So these three windows just break down the process of going out of the macroeconomic equilibrium and back again from the Phillips curve framework into aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework. But the message is the same. The message is that expectations, adaptive expectations, allow for the short-term departure of the unemployment rate and productivity figures from the long run equilibrium. It allows for an inflationary gap. So this point 2 here, in both cases, is an inflationary gap, which is shown in the big picture, in the big image here, as lower unemployment than natural rate of unemployment, you see? So this is the long-term unemployment rate. You cannot go below that in the long run. So, and it is shown in this window 1 as temporarily higher real GDP Q2. And here it shows in window 3 the mechanism whereby the economy goes back to the long run equilibrium by reduction in the rate of productivity and an increase in unemployment rate. Okay, so that's the exhibit 4. What else? One question pertaining to chapter 14, the Federal Reserve System. What is the difference between discount rate and federal funds rate? Okay, so federal funds rate is an interest rate at which private commercial banks lend and borrow money among themselves. Sometimes it is called the overnight loan rate. That means the interest rate at which banks among themselves borrow money. Discount rate is the rate at which the central bank lends money to private banks. So that's the difference. Federal funds rate is a rate at which banks lend to each other. The discount rate is a rate at which the central bank, Federal Reserve in our country, lends money to private banks. And there is another category, the third category here that you have to bear in mind, is called the federal funds target rate. So that's not the same as federal funds rate. Federal funds rate is a market phenomenon. Whatever the interest rate is on the market, the banks are going to lend and borrow money at these interest rates. Federal funds target rate is a rate that the central bank would like to see. So if, for example, the average loan is priced at 3%, is the federal funds rate, the rate at which banks make short-term loans to one another, and the central bank wants to lower this interest rate in order to stimulate the lending and borrowing and credit creation in the economy. It can try to set, it can try two things. It can lend money at discount rates, that's sometimes called the discount window lending. And this is used rarely, merely in the, or mostly in the situations of acute economic distress and crisis. Then the central bank can jump in and say, you cannot borrow, you commercial banks, you cannot borrow at lower rates than 4% from other commercial banks, but I'm gonna lend you at 2%. So that's gonna help you weather the crisis. So that's one way in which the central bank can, Federal Reserve can influence the federal funds rate. Another possibility is for the Federal Reserve System to set the federal funds target rate, which means to say, now the federal funds rate for interbank lending market is 4%. And I'm gonna set a target of 3%. I wanna make it 3%. And then what the central bank does? The central bank does not lend now through the discount window. It doesn't create its own money directly and lends to the bank. It does another thing, which is open market operations. So what is open market operations? So the central bank creates money once again. It's just the technique is different, but the essence of the operation is the same thing. Just print money and buys government bonds from banks and other financial institutions and increases the bank reserves and the amount of cash that exists in the economy. So open market operations are buying and selling government bonds. When the central bank buys government bonds, it simply uh, prints a certain quantity of money and creates the new cash reserves for the bank. In exchange, it accumulates a certain amount of securities, government bonds at its balance sheet. So then now this new money, new cash enters the system, the banking system, and this is a supply of new funds that then will have an unexpected effect on lowering down the interest rate, federal funds rate. Okay, so then the central bank can keep buying government bonds until the actual market federal funds rate at which banks lend money to each other, hits the target rate that the central bank wants to maintain, 3% in our particular case, and then it stops. Okay, so these are the mechanisms of using monetary policy: discount rate and federal funds target rate to influence the federal funds rate, which is the rate at which banks lend and borrow money. Okay, so the three categories that you have to distinguish and to understand: the discount rate, that's the rate at which central banks directly lends money to private banks. Federal funds rate is a rate at which banks lend and borrow among themselves short run. And the third category is the federal funds target rate. That's a rate at which the central bank wants private banks to lend and borrow to each other, and it can influence this rate, lower it down or increase it by buying or selling government bonds, and thereby increasing or decreasing the quantity of money in the system and the cash reserves of the bank. Okay. So that was the last question pertaining to the materials. I got one question that deals with the current financial and economic crisis. And I will read this question to you, and then I'll say I will offer my quick thoughts about this. It doesn't mean that that's correct, just my own opinions about this, and you're free also to weigh in and to read further and try to understand what is going on. So the question is, leveraged loans have increased by 50% from 2015 to now, to 1.2 trillion. So loans. These are risky loans with higher interest rate. With low interest rates, this seems to have increased demand for these risky loans. I don't quite understand these. So at any rate, the leveraging or private firms have increased significantly in the last few years. A lot of companies have taken these loans along with a lot of debt, and now with the coronavirus shock, that has made the companies vulnerable. They can't continue business and don't have the income to pay employees. There are about 1,400 companies with these loans, and some 400 to 1,500 companies will have to default. Mutual funds, investment, and pension ties to these loans can be stuck with pennies to the dollar. So what's going to happen? Also, the debt of these loans is similar to the subprime loans in 2008, which at its peak was 1.3 trillion. How will this have a ripple effect on the nation? What could be the fallout from a leveraged debt crisis? So the question is, how is this recession going to affect the financial market? My take on this is, although it's not my specialty, okay, financial markets and financial economics, but my view of this is that probably it's not going to be as bad as 2018 and 2008 and 2009. At least it looks so now, because The corporate debt is still significant, maybe comparable to, I don't know the exact figures, but comparable um, to the corporate debt in 2008, 2007, 2008. Actually, I just saw the figures today in Wall Street journals. They're similar. They even slightly increased, but the size of the pie increased. So as a percentage of assets, corporate debt is similar as in 2008. But one important thing changed from 2007, 2008. That means that the household debt has gone down sharply. So families are less indebted now than they used to be 10 years ago or 11 years ago. No, that would be 12, 13 years ago. Gee, how time is passing. So that's one of the main reasons for optimism. And what does that mean? The households being less in debt, that means that, remember what we discussed, the credit market. The credit market is a complicated beast, but the critical component is the savings rate. So many of the families have much more of a financial cushion than they used to have in the previous economic crisis. The banks are better capitalized than in 2007, 2008. That's another reason. So the first, families have more of a financial cushion than before. So they have some savings to weather the short-term economic trouble. If we assume that this recession is going to be very deep and sharp and painful, but relatively short, there shouldn't be grave economic problems. If this recession, if we, as it seems now, go back to working in maybe a month or so, month and a half, then uh, we could weather the storm. So this financial cushion that we have, higher rate of savings that we have, will allow us to weather the storm, and then it will allow a greater amount of savings and credit. One of the main problems of the financial crisis in 2008 was this credit crunch, shortage of credit, because people were strapped for cash. They didn't have enough savings, so they used all of their money that they had, putting it aside, or using it just to survive. So there was not enough credit creation. There was not enough saving to create credit for the market to sustain the leveraged firms in the long run. So yes, many companies will go bankrupt, but I suspect slightly less in the long run, when everything is said and done, slightly less than in 2008, because the household savings are significantly higher now than they used to be in 2008. And household savings is the main source of funds for credit creation, for the loanable funds. That's where the money is coming from for the companies. There's no great mystery about that. People saving parts of their income and channeling it through the financial system and banking system into the real economy. Now fortunately, we have greater percentage of our income is saved, so everybody is slightly better equipped to weather the storm. The second reason why we might be more resilient this time around is that the financial system and banks are better capitalized. This means that they have much more reserves than they used to have before. So you will remember that I talked earlier in the semester, even before the recession became in the cards, it became obvious that the recession might be in the cards. That one of the reasons for relatively slower economic growth in recent 7, 8, 9 years was that the banks were reluctant to lend the money. That the Federal Reserve created trillions and trillions of dollars and just swamped the financial system with the money, and that banks got this money, but that they kept a huge amount of excess reserves, which means that you have to keep 10% of your demand deposits. The banks were keeping like much, much more than that. And now that comes in handy. Now, when we are in a situation, banks have much more cash in reserve that they can use then to weather the storm. So if nothing catastrophic and apocalyptic happens in the economy, you can never know, then the banks should be much more resilient, and financial system could be much more resilient than it was 12 years ago. So these are two reasons. I'm in general pessimistic whenever we talk about politicians. So I'm horrified with what's going on with these quarantines, that they want to continue with this madness for weeks, if not months. You saw that 60 million people lost their jobs in just 3 weeks. That's horrific. That never happened before, not even close. But two reasons, or actually three reasons for optimism is that first, the anger and resentment will grow quickly, and politicians will have to adjust, will have to open up the economy, because now the coronavirus is peaking and starting to going down. So in a week or two, it's going to be almost gone. So the pressure will build to open up the economy. So that's one reason. The second reason is that the banks are better positioned to weather the storm than 12 years ago. So then these loans, these leveraged position of American corporations might be less of a problem now than it used to be. And then the savings rate of private households is greater. Okay. So these are pluses. The big minus is the uncertainty about this thing that is going on now. So this is unprecedented loss of jobs in 3 weeks, like 60 million new unemployment claims in 3 weeks. That's simply in literal sense of the charts. It's never had been more than 400,000 or 500,000 per week. Now it's 6 million per week. 6,600,000 last week. So it's going to be very sharp drop in the level of economic activity when you shut down the entire economy for a month or two. What else could you expect? 20-30% of real GDP could be gone by May or by June. But then if we open up the economy and things start quickly to go back to normal, then we can grow very quickly and make up for this loss. Now that's a big if. So we don't know exactly what's going to happen. We cannot predict what politicians will do. So if things continue to deteriorate in terms of the political climate and economic climate, if some genius decides to continue shutdowns for 6 months, for 12 months, until the economy, until the vaccine is invented for this disease, then we are toast. But then the leveraged position of corporations will be least of our problems. Then we will have to figure out what to eat next winter. If they close down the economy for 6 months, there will not be enough food in this country in 12 months. Fortunately, that's not very likely. Of course, reason will have to prevail in the next few weeks. So, and then if reason prevails, and if everything happens as it now seems likely, then these problems of huge leverage will exist, but will not be fatal for the American economy. Okay, that's all for now. Please keep sending me your questions and comments, so I may record them next week, depending on how many questions I get, another Q&A session for you to help you in your preparations. So God bless and have a nice and blissful Easter. Stay healthy, stay optimistic, and I'll see you in virtual space next week. Bye-bye.